Hey guys, how's it going? It's Alexander Williamson here with The Secret History Living Inside Your Aquarium. Today, we're going to be talking about Java ferns. And this is an amazing little plant, great for pros and longtime fish keepers as well as beginners alike. It comes in many forms and it is very versatile, and we're going to talk about that. But first, I want you to see where this came from, which is a CO2 high-light, high-tech tank with liquid fertilizer, aqua soil, lots of fish swimming around, lots of nitrogen from them. But it can also survive in very low-tech, low-light tanks, like we're going to see in a moment. But if you've kept Java ferns already, you may be wondering a couple things about them. Like, what are those spots? And maybe you know the answer to the first part of that question and you think spores, that's easy. But what about when it's not doing so well and it's more than just those spores that look like spots? Well, let's explore that right now. We're going to go look at the low-tech setup, and we're going to look at a couple different kinds of Java fern and hopefully learn a little bit of history and interesting tidbits along the way. So let's check it out. Alright guys, so this is a low-tech tank where we've got gravel. We do have a little bit of aqua soil, but it doesn't need it, and you don't plant your Java ferns. You simply secure them to some sort of porous stone or a piece of wood, and they'll do just fine. They'll grow great in these conditions. So here you see big healthy chunk of Java fern. There's a bunch back hidden around the rest of the tank as well, all doing great. And this is a medium to, I'd say, well, it's probably a medium light tank, but it grows just as well in low light tanks like it is down in here too. So let's talk about the plant itself. Leptochilus pteropus. That's what it's known on, and not known as on land. And that's because this plant can survive on land just as easily as it can underwater, if not more so. It just needs a very humid environment like the rainforests. Now, when we're talking about all the different kinds that there are and variations, and we're looking at the species, same plant, same creature, but it's underwater, it actually alters its epigenetics, almost like going through puberty, and it becomes a submerged form or an immersed form, and it's known as Microsorum pteropus, just like before with the pteropus. And the pteropus means wing-footed or bat, and that is because of the leaves kind of looking like bat ears. And the same man who was named Carl Ludwig Bloom, who explored India and a lot of the subcontinent of India throughout Southeast Asia, down through Bangladesh, all the way up to China, and then down through Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and into Indonesia, as well as Java, Borneo, and Papua New Guinea. Now, coincidentally, this plant was found all those places, and he also studied insects as well as small mammals and birds. And so Carl Ludwig Bloom, he was half German, half Dutch, and he set up the first conservatory or botany museum in Germany or in the Netherlands. And him, as well as several other last names you may recognize from the sword plant or fern world, Prince Kleiner, as well as the Franz Stoffel, those names sound familiar. They all went on this expedition between 1823 and 1826, and they ended in Java and ended up spending the most time there because at that time in colonial history, the smallest amount was known about Java or Indonesia, the big island in Indonesia at the time. So he took all his findings, he took many cuttings and samples, and this was one very successful plant that he found later would grow underwater just fine. I mean, he observed that in the field, but they were able to replicate that right away. And that's why it's a great choice for us in the aquarium hobby. So let's scoot this aside and take a look at the kind of setup here we've got. We've got water conditions for this plant that are needed that are very, very wide-ranging. So you can have anywhere between 60-degree water and 84-degree water. That's in Fahrenheit. And so this tank's around 75 degrees. That's 15 to 28 degrees in Celsius. You can have anywhere between 3 and 10 GH, which is the hardness, the general hardness, or the calcium and carbonate in the water, the salt as well. And the interesting thing about it is they actually can survive in salt water as well as fresh water, which I think is pretty cool. Mangroves are another tree that can do that, but there aren't that many small plants that are capable of it. So when we're looking at it, it can be in the dark corner of your tank, or it can be under a medium light. The only place you don't really want it is under a highlight. You can kind of burn it out if you're using something like a Fluval 3.0 or a Twin Star or a Kessel. If these all sound like foreign words to you from Star Trek, then don't worry about it. Your lamp or light is probably not going to be so bright as to burn them, so I would just not worry about it and just buy the plant, enjoy it, and affix it to something in your tank. You can use super glue, you can use thread, you can use lead weights actually to hold it down. So there's lots of options, bread ties, whatever floats your boat. And it's a slow growing plant, and it's usually found at the base of waterfalls or along creeks or under canopies in jungles on a rocky forest floor that floods some of the time. Here we can see another very similar species. This is Bulbitus Hedgelotta. This is an African species, but there's also an Asian species back in here. And so they all love this kind of setup, this kind of ecosystem. And the main thing that this plant needs nutrients-wise is nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and manganese. Now, the really cool thing about this plant is most of them don't need much more than that, and they can deal with the amounts that we find in our current average aquariums if you have fish in them. Your fish and the food they eat will produce that. However, if you're growing lots of plants and you're doing it quickly, you can run out of those nutrients and run into a couple problems. So the other problem you can run into is if your pH is way too hard, which wouldn't be a nutrient issue, but at the same time it's a water parameter issue. And that would be if it's over around 7.6, you can run into some trouble. Some people report keeping it all the way into the 8 range, but it's happiest in the 6 to 7 range. Too acidic, and it also can have problems and start to fall apart. And I actually brought an example of one that was in a 5.0 tank to show you guys. This is what happens. It starts to fall apart, turn red and orange, and it's just too acidic. It literally eats through the leaves. So what also happens when this occurs is the plant's metabolism can turn against itself, and it can get what we call galls. And a lot of people will Google, what is this about? So there can be a number of reasons. The first, which I mentioned, are CO2 and, or sorry, not CO2, that's the second. The first, which I mentioned, are the pH in the water can either burn it or, I guess, burn it in the other way with a bleach or basic substance. Or it can be a lack of CO2, and that means that your plant's probably under medium light, under medium flow, but it's not able to build. It has enough nutrients, but the CO2, there's not enough in the water for it to grow, and it will get these black spots on it, and it will start to die also. So that's what these black spots are about. However, the spots that are not to worry about, that everybody should be familiar with in the fern and plant world if you're getting into aquarium plants, are these. And these are spores. Just like on a terrestrial fern that's on land, these are little seed banks basically. Just like a mushroom or moss, these have not seeds but spores. They don't reproduce sexually with the flower, so they don't flower or blossom. But these little spores turn into little miniature plants. You see that? They start on the tip of the plant, and then they eventually break off. So these plants at a certain size are designed to actually die. Around somewhere between 12 and 16 inches long, if not smaller depending on nutrients, they're designed to do this. Or if they reach the top of the water. So they're designed to do this. Don't worry about it. If you want, you can help them once you feel a firm little nodule up there. And you start to see brown. Now this brown is a rhizome. And these little roots down here, this is all part of the rhizome. And right here, we've got the main rhizome stem. And then we've got the running roots down below it. Now, never bury this, it will rot. But these are what extract a lot of nutrients as well as the pores in the plant. Now, the kind we're looking at here is specifically Trident. And all throughout that huge range that I mentioned earlier, there are lots and lots of kinds of these amazing plants. So there's the Trident kind. There is also a kind called Thor's hammer that splits off into the top, kind of like the image of Thor's hammer. This one I wanted to show you another health problem in. So this one got burned by too much light. It turned yellow. So when it turned yellow, it's either lacking some of its core nutrients, and like I said, iron, manganese, nitrogen, and phosphorus are the main ones it needs, as well as CO2, which would be carbon and oxygen. But if it's missing any bit of phosphorus, this can also happen. You can, or potassium in rare cases. You can see this. Now, these are problems that you run into actually more often in high-tech tanks because the plant's metabolism, which is controlled by the phosphorus or phosphates, is in full tilt. And because of this, it starts to go haywire, and you can get these galls, which are a form of cancer. They're hard little nodules that are either black or green, and they're on the opposite side of the leaf as the spore usually, and then the plant will start to die. Now, this cancer will spread all throughout the plant, and you need to kill it. You need to get rid of these. So sadly, I'll have to cut all this off. But happily, I've got a ball of rhizome here, which will totally grow back, and hopefully it will no longer have this issue. However, sometimes it is a genetic issue with the whole plant. So let's just go over, basically, for all the problems you may encounter with Java ferns, the answer is to prune it, prune it, prune it. So it doesn't really matter what it is. You can fix those nutrients problems and things, but you're still going to need to prune it. Now here you can see more of the gall forming. And according to Tom Barr, he believes CO2 is what causes it. A crash in CO2 will then cause it not being able to process the nutrients, which you'll have to watch some other videos on how plants process nutrients or how plants eat to understand all of that. But it causes a crash, and then it causes a mutation. And just like these can mutate from living on land to living underwater during flood season, they can mutate again, and these are cells that are replicating too fast, which is exactly what cancer is in humans, cells out of control. Now, to get rid of it, like I said, you fix the underlying problem, either CO2 or phosphorus usually. You can use a one-a-day type of fertilizer, a liquid fertilizer. Don't use root tabs or any sort of aqua soil like these because it won't help your plant at all. But if you use one of the other ones, it'll work out great. One of the one-a-day, you could use something like Aquarium Co-ops or Nilox, or you can use, there's all sorts on the market. Prime has one, Flourish, I believe. So do some research and find the one you like, and you'll have a healthy plant. Now, it gets some holes like this, sometimes little critters. In here I've got plecos and things that sometimes will clean the algae off of it, and they'll do a rough job. But what happened on the underside here was it got cyanobacteria and it got a dark coat. Well, that means it can't photosynthesize. So all I have to do to fix that is literally wipe it off and get rid of it on a towel. That's it. Or I could, in theory, if I never want it to come back in the entire aquarium, I could take care of it with an antibiotic. But be careful about your cycle in your tank of beneficial bacteria when you do that. So that kind of covers the basics about it. And I think this plant is beautiful. You can tie it down to rocks. It'll grow in big clumps, and the way to get it to grow quicker is not by throwing just tons and tons of light. It's slow and steady, wins the race. And then the other thing is you want to let it grow to the surface or grow to that foot-long to 16-inch size, and it will start to put out its own little baby plants. Now, when it's young and still in its vegetative growing stage, or if it's been underwater its entire life, sometimes you won't see those little black dots, those spores. But once it reaches maturity and the plant is getting sick, it creates those spores and sets them off so they can either float downriver and create something in theory, but more often than not, what it will do is it'll form at the tips of the plant like this, and you can literally just break it off right here, and this floating around loosely in your aquarium will turn into that. That is exactly where I started that. Now you can just rip it, break it, you can use scissors, do it a little classier if you'd like, but it's as easy as that. And there are many forms of this plant, as I talked about. There is that Thor's hammer that we looked at, the Trident, which has 3 pieces. There is narrow leaf, which is back here. Also, these ones I took out because they needed some help. Right here, this is the narrower leaf. And then there's needle leaf, which has a very, very skinny leaf. And a lot of these are from the Philippines and Indonesia, where they're able to have been alive in ecosystems that are very isolated on islands for thousands, if not millions of years. And so they've adapted just different traits through both random mutation and through, adapting to their environment. Maybe the skinny forms don't need as much light. So then people took these, and maybe they need more nutrients and less light, so they care less about photosynthesizing. So they maximize surface area for sucking up things in the water that are good for them, but then minimize the amount of light that they need to get, which lets them grow out farther in the river on a log, say in the middle of the river. And this then allows them to survive in more and more environments. And because of this, it's a very, very adaptable plant, like I said. And humans noticed this very quickly. And even in the early days of this plant's existence, when humans first noticed it, indigenous groups in Bangladesh, as well as Myanmar, or aka Burma, and Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia all noted it for its properties of helping fevers, as well as clearing out stomach parasites, because it's very bitter and it causes an upset stomach. But apparently it clears out certain types of worm infections. So these different types of the plant, you can imagine that something in southern China is going to look different than in the tropical islands down in the Philippines or Indonesia or Borneo even. Humans then took these and looked for these mutations, and they selectively bred them horticulturally into the forms we see now. So I hope this video helped you guys a little bit understanding in what all these plants can go through. Pretty much anything but high light. They need a little bit of moving water, and they can't have a pH that's too crazy. But most of the nutrient problems are actually pretty rare. They're hard unless you're in the upper level of aquascaping with a higher light, or where you're fluctuating specific nutrients one at a time over and over. The less water changes you do, and the longer you've had your tank, the more bacteria that has equalized, the more that it's just going to stabilize, and you'll have a beautiful plant that you can trim. As it comes to the top, you can cut off the plantlets and start more plants, and then tie them down next to the adults, and pretty soon, within a year, you can double the volume of your plants. You can have a football size of this stuff. So it's a very manageable and very, very cool plant. I hope you guys enjoyed that. This has been The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. There's lots of links to people who sell this stuff. Aquatic Art's one of my favorite vendors below, as well as discounts. They've got lots of nano fish and shrimp too. And I've also got links to my Patreon as well as to a Facebook group where we just help each other out and share things with one another, like interesting plants we have, or what are those little brown dots on my Java fern? That is how these videos get made. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!